really thrilled to be here with Gabe and Crystal to talk about Mr. Gaines and his work. Um, long before I had the honor and the thrill of meeting him in Louisiana, I felt like I knew him. He was like a grandfather or an uncle or a trusted family friend. Like generations of people, I've loved his work, analyzed it, discussed it, cherished it on the page, and also in the movies, the TV movies made from four of his novels. His stories about the lives of the struggles of people living from places like where I'm from, rural places, and the people that I know have been a treasured part of my life. Mr. Gaines left the South in 1948, but he left because he had to. He had no options if he stayed. He could continue to work in the fields where he worked in the cane fields since he was 8 or 9, or he would have a chance to be educated. At home in Louisiana, there were no junior or senior high schools for Black children, and there was no library for anybody Black. So his mother and stepfather sent for him when he was about 14, and he spent over 40 years in California. It was there that he found the library, and he found the literature of the world, and especially Russian writers. He said in an essay, I went to Chekhov, from Chekhov to Tolstoy, then to the rest of the Russians, especially Turgenev's sportsman sketches and his fathers and sons. The 19th century Russian writers became my favorites. They still are. I feel that they wrote truly about peasantry. Their peasants were not caricatures or clowns. They did not make fun of them. They were people. They were good. They were bad. They could be as brutal as any man. They could be as kind. The American writers in general, the Southern writer in particular, never saw peasantry, especially Black peasantry, in this way. Blacks were either caricatures of human beings or they were problems. They needed to be saved or they were saviors. They were either children or they were seers, but they were very seldom what the average human being was. Mr. Gaines' desire was to write like the authors that he admired about the dignity of every one of his characters, but he wanted this set in his home pastures of Louisiana. He said, I wanted to smell that Louisiana earth, feel the Louisiana sun, sit under the shade of one of those Louisiana oaks. I wanted to see on paper those Louisiana Black children walking to school on cold days while yellow Louisiana buses pass them by. I wanted to see on paper those Black parents going to work before the sun came up and coming back home to look after their children after the sun went down. His desire to showcase his world as a locus of complex human stories is there from the beginning of his writings. Um, Mr. Gaines was in a man named Stanley Anderson's English composition class at San Francisco State, and he was doing very poorly, averaging about D's. So he talked to his teacher and he asked if he could write a story, a fiction, instead of a composition. And Mr. Anderson told him that if you think you can say what needs to be said in fiction, go ahead and try. So I want to read a little bit of that early story. This is 1956, a story called The Turtles. And this was the first story published in the San Francisco State Literary Magazine. That's where he found his agent. The agent saw it. She became his agent until she died. Um, and that was many years later. This is a story about two fathers and two sons. This is a story about the expectations of masculinity that complicate and often sully the relationships between men. It's about the tragedy of disconnection and the pain of a brutal and stunted love. The complex stories of fathers and sons and male mentorship and friendship is a subject Gaines would return to many times in several novels over his career, including A Lesson Before Dying. In The Turtles, the fathers and son go fishing, and on the way home, they stop off at a house owned by a couple of single women. One of the women, Amy, is at home. These women are outside the transactions of the community. No one socializes with these women at all. They buy groceries in town, but they're not welcome in anybody's house or even on anybody's porch. So let me just read this very brief excerpt from The Turtles. Amy was sitting on the porch when we went into the yard. Diana home, Amy? My old man asked. She went to town, Amy said. My old man looked at Amy. Well, we just want a drink of water, my old man said. Amy smiled. Well's in the back, she said. Help yourself. My old man and Mr. James went around the house, and Benny and I stood out in the yard next to the porch. Amy looked at us, then she went in the house. My old man and Mr. James came back and sat at the end of the porch. It's been hot today, my old man said. Yes, Mr. James said. Then they didn't say anything, and my old man took out his pocket handkerchief and wiped his face and neck. They didn't look like they were going to be moving soon, so I leaned against the steps to rest a while. Benny moved along to the big mulberry tree that Mrs. Diana Brown had in her front yard. Max, my old man said, I want you to go into the house and go into the first room on your right. Just push the door open and go in there. What for? I asked. Because I said so, my old man said. Yes, sir. I went up on the porch and into the house. I pushed the door open like my old man had told me to, and I saw Amy lying in the bed under the spread. She was covered up all the way to her neck. Hi, Max, she said. I looked at Amy, but I didn't say anything. The window right in the back of the bedroom was opened, but the two curtains were very still. It had been a hot day and no wind was blowing. I looked at Amy, grinning at me, and I backed out of the room and went back on the porch. Pa, I started to say. My old man jumped like something unexpectedly had hit him. What are you doing out here, Max? He said. Amy is in there. I know she's in there, my old man said. She's in the bed, I said. I know that too, my old man said. Go back in there like I told you. I went back to the door and thought maybe my old man had made a mistake about the room. I went back out to the porch. Pa, is that the right room? I said. My old man looked at me like he knew I was going to come back out there. Max, he said, looking at me, if you come back out here one more time without going into that room and staying in there, I'm going to take my belt off to you. Yes, sir. I went back to the room where Amy was and stood just inside the door. Max is afraid of girls, Amy sang. You afraid of me, Max? I'm not afraid of anybody, I said. Then come here, she said. I'd rather stand where I'm at, I said. Your pa want you to come where I'm at, she said. I looked at Amy and I wanted to leave the room again, but I thought about my old man. Not that he would whip me. I knew that he'd been bluffing out on the porch. He had never whipped me, and I doubt he ever would. But that wasn't what I thought about. I thought about our friendship and our partnership. I had been his partner since Mom had died, and that had been a long time, and nothing had broken it up because I always obeyed him. And I knew as long as I obeyed him, the partnership would last. When I didn't, it would end. I wasn't ready for that to happen. So I went where she was, like he told me to. When I went back out on the porch, my old man was sitting with his back against the post. He had one leg drawn up on the porch. He gave me a glance as I passed by him, going to the end of the porch to sit down, but he didn't tell me anything. I looked at Benny sitting down on the ground against a tree. He had a little stick in his hand and he was poking on the ground. Mr. James was sitting next to my old man, looking down at his feet. Benny, Mr. James said. And just like that, Benny started crying. Cut that out, Mr. James said. Look at that. Look at that boy. My old man looked at Benny and didn't say anything. 15 years old, Mr. James said, and look at him. Benny cried, poked at the ground with the little stick. Look at Max, Mr. James said. Isn't he still breathing? Isn't he still alive? Did she eat him up? The tears and snot began to run out of Benny's eyes and nose. He kept jabbing the little stick down in the ground. He didn't bother to wipe his face. When you get tired crying, just get up from there and go inside the house, Mr. James said. I've got all night. My old man was looking at Benny, and I knew my old man felt like walking over there and butting Benny's head against the tree. Benny was about a year older than I was, and I knew if he was my old man's son, my old man would have butt his head against that tree. But Benny was not my old man's son, and Mr. James was not like my old man. And so Benny just sat against the tree and cried and jabbed in the ground with the stick. I stood up to go around the house to get some water from the well. Where are you going, Max? My old man asked. Just to get some water. I went around the house, drew some water from the well, and drank. When I came back to the porch, Benny was still sitting against the tree. He'd stopped crying. You ready to go in there now? Mr. James said. Benny started crying again. He still had the little stick. My old man looked at Benny, and then he looked at me. Well, we might as well move along, he said, picking up the string of fishes. You're taking off now, George? Might as well, Mr. James said, and stood up. Mr. James looked at Benny sitting against the tree with his head down, and he picked up his string of fishes. He and my old man started out on the road. I went to the tree where Benny was. You going now, Benny? I asked him. Benny didn't look up. I stood there about a minute looking down at him, and he didn't look up once. Well, I better be going, I said. I have to clean the fish for supper. I caught up with my old man and Mr. James, and we walked down the road without saying anything. When we'd gone about half a mile, Mr. James looked over his shoulder and saw Benny following us. "Damn it," Mr. James said. "This is one day that boy's going to do what I say." Mr. James turned around and started up the road toward Benny. Benny saw him coming and stopped. Mr. James walked up to Benny, grabbed him by the arm, turned him around. We were too far to hear if Benny was crying or not, but within myself, I knew he was crying. My old man and I started walking again. "I guess you think you're a man now," my old man said. "Sir, you heard me." "No, sir," I said, "I don't think I'm a man." "Well, you are," my old man said. I didn't say anything, and my old man didn't say any more. The sun was going down, and the cool dust felt good under my bare feet. These fathers were attempting to force their sons into manhood through the body of a woman. This is a woman with few other choices and for many reasons of her own. And the story strikes me and is so moving to me for a number of reasons. It's not bravado. It's not a good time story. It's full of humor, but it's also full of earnest fathers trying to figure out the best ways that they know how to educate their boys. Mr. Gaines does not judge his characters. He doesn't hold them up to us as objects of pity or outrage or derision. He allows them the full range of their humanity. When the child says he doesn't feel like a man, it's a profound statement of courage and also of independence from the father, which is also very painful. Mr. Gaines was often asked about the origins of his stories. He writes, "I begin with an idea, this point, this fact, sometimes in the past, that we were brought to Africa in chains, put in Louisiana to work the rice and cane fields. Some kind of way we survived. God, luck, soul food, threats of death, superstition, I suppose all of these have played their part. If I asked a white historian what happened, he would not tell it the same way a black historian would. If I asked a black historian, he would not tell it the same way a black field worker would. So I ask them all, and I try in some way to get the answer. But I'm afraid I haven't gotten it yet. Maybe in the next book, or the one after, or the one after, or the one after." Thank you.
Wow, Stephanie, thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from some quotations that Mr. Gaines has and read a little bit of an excerpt. But in 2017, when I accepted the Gaines Award, I wrote in part the following. "Mr. Gaines, it was your work that gave me permission to allow my literary imagination to dwell in the spirit of the place where I grew up, because you embraced your country self, your people, and kept their spirits alive through your fiction. I felt empowered to do the same. Thank you for giving me the permission and the gumption I needed to write about home." So, of course, I was crying and acting a fool as I was reading on the podium with Mr. Gaines, seated just a few feet away from me on the stage. But that's what he gave me long before I met him. That's what he gave me in his work, was permission to value and to lean into place. So in 1995, in an 1995, in an interview with UNESCO Courier, he wrote this about regionalism. Often we think of regionalism as a negative, but he wrote this: "All the great writers are regionalists. Faulkner wrote about Mississippi, Homer about Greece, Balzac about Paris, Shakespeare about a kind of England that doesn't mean they're not universal. People write about what they know best, and readers respond to that wherever they happen to live." So he goes on to speak about his fictional place, Bayonne Parish, and how he was influenced by Faulkner's fictional place that was in Mississippi. And Faulkner was influenced by Sherwood Anderson, I think particularly Winesburg, Ohio, and Joyce's Dublin. And I felt like I was influenced by Mr. Gaines, and found myself influenced when I invented my own fictional town of opulence. I've also found myself influenced by him in his treatment of the land itself. Like him, my family has lived in the same place for many, many generations, likely back until slavery. So the physical landscape. Kentucky for me, Louisiana for Mr. Gaines is one of the main characters in my work, as he said it was for him. Thematically, as Stephanie just talked about, he was often haunted by the father and son relationship, especially father and son separation. You see that in The Sky is Gray. You see that in the story Bloodlines. You see that in My Father's House. And in turn, I found myself haunted by the mother-daughter relationship, particularly as it pertains to the legacy of slavery. Another quote from him, he says, "Fathers and sons were brought here in chains and then separated on the auction block in slave-holding places. Too often our fathers cannot help the sons. African-American fathers do not send us to war. They're very seldom our judges when we're standing on trial. They're not often our doctors. They don't represent us when we're in the courtroom. We often blame him," meaning the father, "without realizing that they've never been given the opportunity to defend us. We fought in every war that this country has ever had, beginning with the War of Independence. And yet, when it comes to defending our families, our children, our wives, some way or another, the white man makes all those decisions, and that separates father and son." So you hear sort of echoes of the book that we're under discussion, A Lesson Before Dying. You hear echoes of that when it talks about the courtroom. And I always have thought it strange that Mr. Gaines was criticized for not being political in his writing, because his work certainly was political, in that it worked from the individual to the community, and often focused on how we survived and are surviving the legacy of slavery. He writes a post-slavery existence, particularly the Black South, and even more particularly in his Bayonne, his Louisiana. And this is something that I have taken from him that I try to mirror in my own writing, though my focus is how Black women are affected. And I am especially, as a parallel, interested in Black mothers and daughters and that dynamic. And sort of lastly, I wanted to point to the communal aspect of Mr. Gaines' writing, both from a thematic point and a craft aspect. I think it's hard as a writer to write community. It's hard to write a crowd scene, but when you're writing from a place that has a long-term shared history, you're writing about a collective existence, a sort of communal memory or a collective memory, if you will. And that is another characteristic from his writing that I have learned from. Life in a small town means that your memory is both your own and simultaneously never your own. Mr. Gaines and his wife, Diane, I think you all probably had a chance to go there, but he and his wife, Miss Diane, owned a home, and what they did was I had an opportunity to bring the church that he grew up in to the back of his house, and that's where it sits now. So they put it up on these risers, and when I was there and we were having lunch, he told me about moving that church from where it had been. Even before he was born, it was there, and the workers put it up on risers. And as he was telling the story, his eyes lit up, and he said that when they were carefully driving the church out, and the church was slowly passing the graveyard, he said it felt like all the ancestors buried in the graveyard were standing up at attention one last time as the church passed by them. And that was such a chilling moment for me as a fan, but also as a writer. I immediately connected it to The Gathering of Old Men, which is one of my favorite books of his. And it reminded me of when the men are all going to the Marshall plantation to stand up for Matthew. And the plan, of course, is that they will each take the blame for the shooting of a white man who had been killed, but they end up in the graveyard, and it's the Black community's graveyard, and each one of those men had somebody who was buried there. So I wanted to read a little bit from the Gathering of Old Men, and this is from Cherry's point of view. We hadn't been there for more than 10, maybe 15 minutes when Jacob stood up and went inside the graveyard. I looked back over my shoulder and I seen him pulling up weeds from Tessie's grave. Tessie was his sister. She was one of them great big pretty mulatto gals who messed around with white men and Black men. The white men wanted her all for themselves, and they told her to stay away from the niggers, but she didn't listen, and they killed her. Ran her through the quarters out into that St. Charles River, Mardi Gras Day, 1947. But listen to this now. Her own people at the old mulatto place wouldn't even take her body home. They was against her living in the first place around the darker people. I'm not dark myself, I'm light as them, but they wouldn't even take her body home. Buried her with the kind she lived with. Maybe that's why Jacob was here today, to make up for what he had done to his sister over 30 years ago. After pulling up the weeds, he knelt down at the head of the grave and made the sign of the cross. Next thing you know, every last one of us was in there visiting our people's graves. You had to walk in grass knee-high to reach some of the graves. The people usually cleaned up the graveyard if they had to bury somebody or for La Toussaint, but nobody had been buried there in a good while, and La Toussaint wasn't for another month, so you had grass, weeds everywhere, pecans and acorns. You could feel them under your feet. You could hear them crack when you stepped on them. We went to our different little family plots, but we wasn't too sure about all the graves. If they had been put there the last 20, 25 years, yes, then we could tell for sure. But say if they'd been there 40 or 50 years ago, it was no way we could tell if we was looking at the right grave for the right person. Most of the graves after a while had just shifted and mixed with the others. Dirty Red was a little bit farther away from the rest of us, more over into the corner. We had never mixed too well with his people. We thought they were too trifling, never doing anything for themselves. Dirty Red was the last one. Maybe that's why he was here today, to do something for all the others. But maybe that's why we were all there, to do something for the others. After I had knelt down and prayed over my own family plot, I wandered over to where Dirty Red was standing all by himself. He was eating pecan and looking down at the weeds that covered the graves. Dirty Red hadn't knelt down or pulled one weed from one grave. Some of the graves was all sunk in. My brother Gabe there, Dirty Red said. I didn't know for sure what spot he was looking at, because soon as he said it, he cracked another pecan with his teeth. Not cracking a couple of them together in his hand, but cracking them one at a time with his teeth. My mom, Jude, my pa, Francois, right there, he said. I still didn't know for sure where he was looking. Uncle Ned right in there somewhere, he said. The whole place was all sunk in, and you had weeds everywhere, so I couldn't tell for sure where Dirty Red was looking. I never looked at his eyes to see if they shifted from one spot to another. But knowing Dirty Red, I figured they probably didn't. That would have been too much like work. Even to bat his eyes was too much for Dirty Red. You got plenty of us in here, I said, looking around the graveyard. I could see Matt, Chimley, Yank, all of them standing near their people's graves. This where you want them to bring you? I asked Dirty Red. Might as well, if it's still here, he said. They getting rid of old graveyards more and more, I said. These white folks coming up today don't have no respect for the dead. So that is one of my favorite passages, and each of the men has ancestors in that graveyard, and it's there with the ancestors that they find the strength to continue on to the Marshall plantation and to put in plan their motion. And when Mr. Gaines told me that story, I immediately connected it to this moment in the novel. And then I immediately made my own connection to my own work. So to transport a lived experience to the fiction in such an eloquent way was a part of his genius, I think, as a writer. And I certainly learned from that.
Oh, thank you, Crystal and Stephanie and Melanie, and I guess for putting this together, and everybody for showing up Wednesday night for this. I think for me, winning the Gaines Award just a couple months ago now, it seems, has already changed my life in these really interesting ways. I think the most prominent way it's changed is that now I can consider myself in this just wonderful lineage of really brilliant authors, right? Stephanie and Crystal included. And while I'm sure you both feel the same way or felt the same way, but I certainly feel like I don't belong, but am, eager to prove that I do, I guess, through the work. And Stephanie, when you briefly mentioned Gaines, reverence for the Russian masters, right? What I find still, what I found the first time I read Lesson Before Dying, what I still, more recently preparing for this event, reread it, is how this does read like just a heavy, brooding Russian Tolstoyan book, right? It's the violence, except for the first couple chapters, the violence is quiet, right? There's a lot of people just walking around angry, burdened by injustice, frustrated that things aren't changing, and in that way, and in his other work too, but particularly in Lesson Before Dying, that this feels like a book that is bigger than the small place it takes, the small setting, right? Like this is a great work of literature, right? He was not just a towering figure in African American literature, whatever we mean when we say that, right? But he was a towering figure in American literature. And so I'm going to read a section, the made from A Lesson Before Dying. I'm going to read a section that made my hair stand up as I read it recently. And this comes from when the sheriff has come to the family of Jefferson, his relations and his close friends, and has decided to tell them when Jefferson is going to be scheduled to be executed, right? And this feels not only prescient for the moment we're living in now, kind of witnessing the litigation of George Floyd's murder by Derek Chauvin, right? This grand injustice that's on trial, right? And feeling hopeless against the system. Maybe we can talk about this later. I'm sure people will be talking about it for years to come, but this sense that they're not going to get it right? Like the sense that the right thing won't be done. You can see kind of the recordings from the child, from the witness stand, and these people giving really moving statements that move me, like move us, right? But it just doesn't seem like the right thing will be done. And I think that Mr. Gaines had this amazing ability to capture that moment emotionally, that moment in all marginalized people's lives where you just see the system not working and you see how hard changing it will be, and you see the reality around you, and just being able to really slow down and capture the emotional weight of that moment. And so I'll stop rambling and just read. I guess this is This is from A Lesson Before Dying. Guidry drank from his cup and looked over the rim at me. He did not like me. I was one of the smart ones. He and Pichot exchanged glances. I could tell they had been talking about it before Reverend Ambrose and I came into the room. Pichot left the explanation up to the sheriff. Easter, he said. He did not want to go on, but he felt he should. After all, a man was going to be put to death. It had to be before or after Easter. It couldn't happen during Lent. I would learn later from the young deputy that the governor had originally signed an execution order to be carried out 2 weeks before Ash Wednesday. But one of his aides pointed out that another execution was scheduled during that time, and because of our state's heavily Catholic population, it might not go well to have 2 executions just before the beginning of Lent. Can we still visit him like we were doing before? I asked. Sure, the sheriff said. But just remember, keep it down. I don't want you aggravating him. He's got just over a month, April 8th. April 8th, I said to no one. April 8th. Friday, April 8th, between noon and 3, the sheriff said. Between noon and 3, I said to no one. Well, if there's no more questions, I have to get on back to town, Deirdre said. He finished his coffee and set the cup and saucer on a lamp table. You won't forget the doctor, Sheriff? Reverend Ambrose asked. You think she'll need him? She ain't been too well lately, the Reverend said. I'll call him from here, Deirdre said. Can he drive down the corridor? It's passable, Pichot said. I went down there yesterday. The sheriff went to the telephone table and made his call to Bayonne. I could hear only part of what he was saying because I could not get that date and time out of my mind. How do people come up with a date and a time to take life from another man? Who made them God? Audrey, let me speak to Sid, Deirdre was saying over the telephone. 12 white men say a black man must die, and another white man sets the date and time without consulting one black person. Justice. The old woman, the sheriff was saying to the doctor, I think she is the one who attended the trial, worked for the family. His nanin, Reverend Ambrose said weakly. The sheriff did not hear the minister. Yes, it's passable, Sid. You won't get your brown and white shoes dirty. They sentence you to death because you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, with no proof that you had anything at all to do with the crime other than being there when it happened. Yet 6 months later, they come and unlock your cage and tell you, we, us, white folks all, have decided it's time for you to die, because this is the convenient date and time. Oh, she's all right. And how is Lucy? The sheriff asked the doctor about his wife. And on Friday too, always on Friday, same time as he died, between 12 and 3. But they can't take this one's life too soon after the recognition of his death, because it might upset the sensitive few. It can happen less than 2 weeks later, though, because even the sensitive few will have forgotten about their Savior's death by then. Give Lucy my love, Deirdre said. I owe you one. The sheriff hung up the telephone and turned to us. He's on his way, and I have to head on back myself. No other questions. We had no more questions. Thank you all for coming, Pichot said. But he was not thanking us for gracing his home with our presence, so much as he was telling us that it was time to leave. Reverend Ambrose and I got up from the couch and went back into the kitchen. Inez looked at us, crying. We must all show courage for Sister Emma's sake, Reverend Ambrose said to her. Inez raised the end of her apron and wiped her eyes. You drove? Reverend Ambrose asked me. I walked. Well, you can ride back down to the quarter with me, he said. I'm not going back down there right now, I said. I'm not going back down there and tell her he's going to die April 8th. Not me. You'd have the strength if you had God, Reverend Ambrose said. That's where you come in, Reverend, I said. I'm going for a long walk in the opposite direction. Excuse me. I went across the backyard out to the road, and I turned left and walked over to the highway and down to the river. The river still ran high from all the rain we had had in the past couple of months, and from the water that drained into it from the bayous and fields. I walked in the ankle-high grass at a safe distance from where the water flowed upon the bank until I found a good place to stop. I could see the houses and trees on the other bank and the cars moving on the road behind them. I tried wiping that away. I wanted to see nothing but miles and miles of clear blue water. Then an island where I could be alone. Or Vivian and me, just the two of us, and absolutely no one else. No one else. But the river remained the same, high and muddy, and I started walking again. When I could go no further without getting my feet wet, I went up the bank and walked alongside the road. I must have gone 3 or 4 miles before turning back. I figured that by now the minister and my aunt had seen Miss Emma, and the doctor had probably visited her, and other women in the quarter had gone to look after her too. It was near dark when I reached the quarter and went back to the church to get my satchel. Irene had collected all the papers and stacked them neatly on the table and had left me a note saying that the children had been orderly. I stuffed the note and the papers inside my satchel and left the church. So I don't know if you're like me, but I don't know, does writing get much better than that? I don't really think so. I really don't. And I won't really speak too much about it because I want to leave us enough time for questions. But I was thinking about what makes Mr. Gaines a truly unique writer. And I think that it's captured in that passage I just read, how he's able to intertwine all these different emotions and histories, right, into one passage, right? We have just disillusionment next to anger, next to respect and kindness, right? There's this weird kindness in them deciding not to execute this man on a certain day, right? Out of, I guess, fear of anger from other people, but also just out of some weird respect, right? Just this strangeness that exists in this community where you're balancing all these different emotions at one time. And I think that that's something that Mr. Gaines is uniquely great at doing, but I think it's something that's also just this really beautiful and poetic aspect of Black writing, right? Like marginalized writing, just this idea that like we have to take in all these different realities and wrongs at once and try and clarify them on the page. And yeah, so it's what a beautiful man, I think. And I think we'll have enough time for questions.
Well, thank all three of you for those really powerful readings and just really such moving tributes to such a great writer. We do have a few questions already, and if anybody else in the audience has questions, feel free to just throw those in the Q&A right now. Start with the first one here. What is your take on a writer writing art for art's sake? Is it possible, necessary for every writer to be political?
Well, since this is about Mr. Gaines, I'll sort of turn it back on him. I read a lot of the whole collection of his interviews from, I don't know, the early 60s. I think they started all the way up till 2017 when he wrote his last book. And I think that bothered him that certain writers didn't think that he was political enough when he thought he was being extremely political. How much more political can you get when you're talking about sort of a lived experience, someone sort of surviving the South for many, many generations. And so I think that a lot of times we think of the political when we're writing too overtly, that it has to be sort of a protest, that there has to be a placard up in order for something to be political. But I think all Black writing and like Gabe said, from marginalized people are political on some level, because you're writing from a lived experience, an experience through a character or a cast of characters that are dealing with their everyday lives, which have been politicized from oppression. So I think writers of color and Black writers, marginalized writers, we don't get sort of the luxury of writing about art for art's sake. Certainly that's how I feel. I don't think it exists.
Well, and I guess what I'd add is that I've even tried to write. I don't, because I don't even know how to say, like something that's not political, right? But like I've like tried to write things, and I think even my first book is an attempt to just write a story about a young Black man in a Black part of the world just going about his day, and it was impossible to keep any kind of politics, because even that word I think is complicated, but it's impossible to keep any kind of violence against Black people, I don't know, out of stories of Black lives, just in particular parts in America, certainly in the South Side of Chicago, and I think certainly in the South, right? Like I just don't know how you can do it. Even if you try to do it, you're not really doing it, I guess is how so I get, yeah, Crystal, I agree. Yeah.
I would too. I think that there's that even when there's the attempt, as you're mentioning, Gabe, to go away from the political, that it's written on our bodies, that and so we're by default in some ways writing about the political. But I think too, just to think about it on slightly different perspective, I think that that's expected of us as writers, and I think that sometimes that is what the only thing that is valued, that this is what this is your sphere of influence, this is what you understand, and so that's how the writing is approached sometimes by readers. And so we're not, as Crystal was mentioning, given the luxury of, let's look at this as an aesthetic object, let's look at this as art. It's first looked at through this other lens, which I think is absolutely there, but it's not the only thing that's there.
And even just to add one more thing, just to connect this to the Russian master, which is like this thread that I'm really fascinated about, right? But like Tolstoy was, I think, a political writer, right? In a lot of ways, and I think that we approach like Anna Karenina and War and Peace in different ways, right, than we approach someone like Ernest Gaines, Mr. Gaines's work, right? And like even just every section that was read tonight, like that's the good stuff, right? That's the old like classic, just writing no matter what it's about, just on the craft and like on line and character develop, like just the putting it together is amazing writing.
I think I don't want to belabor this, but I think I would like to see us though appreciated more on a craft level. You know, I'm a big fan of Gail Jones, and she always talks about that we're not given credit for our artistic selves, our linguistic abilities. Like whenever she went to speak, people assumed she was going to speak just the way her characters speak because they thought that that was just sort of ourselves, putting ourselves on the page instead of creating art. So even when we're writing about political, it's not an easy sort of regurgitation. There is an art and a craft to it as well.
And just one more thing about Mr. Gaines. I feel like that what he did was such political act to say these lives matter. They're worthy of the page. These are just poor people that many other writers and critics have discounted. And he said this matters, and that is as political a statement as you can make.
Well, just like Sherwood Anderson and Joyce, as we were saying, like just like writers, you know, from other walks like that.
We have a question. I'm a college writing teacher, and I am teaching a lesson before dying as part of a class on dynamic teachers and reactive students next year. Given the role of Grant as both a teacher of elementary students and Jefferson's teacher, what do y'all think Gaines is trying to tell us about education, learning, unlearning, and myth?
We're all sort of, go ahead,
Well,
Stephanie. Or everybody turn their cameras on.
Just kind of feeding that question through. It's a really interesting question. You know, Grant is an interesting character and a very good character because Mr. Gaines allows him his flaws and his false starts and his weirdnesses. There's a moment in that book when he slaps a child who's not really with getting it. And I'm like, oh, don't do that, but he allows that because he's a real person on the page. And the one thing that I love about this character is his patience. When he's sitting there and trying to draw this man out, and he won't talk to him, and he just keeps coming back. Nothing, no grand gestures, no circus antics. He's just there. And I think that even with students who are adults, and I teach college students too, the idea that you're going to be there, that that time after time you're gonna be on their side. You got their back just by your presence is really important.
Okay. Another question. I heard an actor say we have enough stories about Black pain and need more stories about Black joy. Can you speak to your feelings about that?
I guess I've actually been thinking about this a lot too, maybe because I've seen the same tweet or something. It seems to be like something that's existing on Twitter a lot, this conversation about Black joy. I mean, I think life is pain and joy, right? Like I think that it's hard to just have a life that is all good and all bad, because that's not really how it ends up working, right? Like as far as centering like for me, I like to imagine, I think that like Mr. Gaines does this too. It's just that the joy is the thing that's holding everything together, right? Like the joy is the thing that keeps everything from collapsing, because the pain can be so overbearing sometimes. And like when I'm writing, and I can tell, you know, when Mr. Gaines is writing, I'm sure we all feel this way too. Like the joyful moments are the most fun to write. Like, who doesn't love writing about two people falling in love? Like even in A Lesson Before Dying, the scenes where Grant is like imagining love and lust and like romance are just really just tender and heartfelt and beautiful, right? And I feel like there is both, but and maybe this conversation about Hollywood centering stories of Black pain over stories of Black joy is because, you know, like 12 Years a Slave wins an Oscar, right? And like these kind of these movies that do center just real like pain and kind of Black people in subservience can end up getting acclaim for whatever reasons that is hard to unpack here now. But I feel like I see Black joy on TV, right? In shows, like even in like I was watching Greenleaf, that show like Greenleaf with my mom a lot, like just kind of a dramatic, sappy drama about a church, right? And like there's a lot of just joy and silliness, and it's like drama and over the top. But I feel like there are stories like that happening. It's just what's being you know, what's being broadcasted like at a higher bandwidth. Well, maybe not.
Um, just really briefly, I think that I absolutely agree with that. There's joy in all of these books. You know, it's amazing how much he packs into these very, very difficult lives, these moments of, you know, of just a beautiful meal or people connecting on some deep and powerful level. But I think sometimes people are reacting to the idea that this of the spectacle, you know, the spectacle of Black pain, and it feels like gratuitous, or it feels like that let me tell you something else about Black pain that you don't know, and it becomes a kind of spectacle. And I think people I do think that that is something to push back against, that there is a wholeness to the human condition and to our characters that we need to showcase, and that we do showcase, but sometimes the spectacle is kind of takes over, and that's what people remember or talk about.
So we just have a little bit of time left. I'm going to try to collapse the remaining questions into a little nugget. The novel, A Lesson Before Dying, brilliantly demonstrates the dehumanization of one group of people inflict on another, and also the resistance to that. Do you feel that this time of Black Lives Matter is more than a moment? What can we all do not to let this moment pass, in addition to teaching books like A Lesson Before Dying in school? What can we do to not let the myth of white supremacy persist? That's a big, big question, but do what you can with it.
Well, I'm not sure that white supremacy is a myth. We're certainly seeing it acted out in a very real way. But I think as far as art goes, as you were talking, Melanie, I was thinking about how at the very beginning of this book, just one word sort of sums it up when the word hog is used. And you get sort of decades and decades of dehumanization with one. I'm almost crying just thinking about it, just with one word, of not seeing the humanity in people. And I think that's what brilliant art, that's what brilliant writing can do. I mean, it's shown through the whole book, but it's there at the very beginning once he's called a hog.
We just got one more question, and I feel like it's a really important one for young writers to hear the answer to. I'm in an MFA program, and it's been a challenge to write so that my non-BIPOC cohort understand. I also find that some of the faculty push back on my packets because of it. How do I continue to write my story without lessening me and my voice?
this this is something that I've really been thinking a lot about, and thinking about what would I what did I need, what did I want in my program that I didn't get, because I had those same moments of presenting a story that maybe didn't seem important to other people, and so it was treated that way, or a way of speaking with the characters that seemed like that didn't seem that and I was told that that's we don't do that kind of speech anymore in writing, that those kinds of things. And I think that looking for your community, is so important. If there's even one other person that you can share your work with, even one that you could that who will understand what you're going for, will understand why you need to say something a particular way, will understand the importance of your story, is so vitally important. I mean, it's wonderful if you can have a whole cohort and a whole class, but yes, even somebody outside your program, absolutely. And sometimes you will have to do that, because most of us have the experience, if you are a writer of color, BIPOC writer, of being the only one. And so just finding that one person is vitally important, and was vitally important to me. And it happened to be somebody who's states away, and but just having that one ear and that one support was really important.
Stephanie, Gabriel, Crystal, what an amazing panel. What a great conversation. Thank you for bringing your thoughts and your perspectives and your love to the panel tonight, and for Ernest Gaines's work, and for being part of his legacy. And thank you for your beautiful work. I put links to purchase all of your books in the chat. So folks, please, if you feel so moved to read everything they've ever written, buy the books from us, and keep supporting fiction writers. And join us again for more events soon. And Stephanie, Gabriel, and Crystal, I hope we can meet in the auditorium at the Center for Fiction someday. Thanks again for joining us, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Melanie. And congratulations, Crystal.
Oh, thank you.
Poet Laureate of Kentucky.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.